Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Let those eyes soften, not closed, just resting. Let them blur as the room goes quiet around you, and you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will find you. Sink into the bed beneath you. Let it take your weight fully, like it's holding you in place. And breathe slow and don't move. And if the light in the room dims for a moment, as if something passed in front of it, ignore it. The longer you stay still, the sooner it moves on. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The house had been built to endure. It stood at the end of the road with the quiet confidence of old money, its wide frontage turned slightly away from the street as though it had nothing to prove to those passing by. Inside, the ceilings were high and darkened by decades of smoke from coal fires. Rugs lay heavy underfoot, their patterns worn thin in places where generations had crossed the same rooms again and again. The walls were lined with portraits, men in stiff collars, women posed with expressions of restraint rather than warmth. Everything about the place spoke of permanence, of ownership, of a family accustomed to having its way. The Hargreaves had made their fortune slowly, land rents at first, then investments, then quiet influence. Nothing flashy, nothing new. The house had been paid for long before Sharon Hargreave had ever set foot inside it, long before she had become Mrs. Edmund Hargreave, long before she had learned how heavy silence could be when it was enforced. Now, in the largest room on the ground floor, Edmund lay at rest. The coffin stood in the center of the space, raised on trestles, its lid open. Edmund Hargreave lay within, dressed carefully, his hands folded, his face arranged into something approaching dignity. The undertaker had done his best. Beneath the fabric, the damage of the accident was concealed, the broken bones, the crushed places. Nothing of it showed now. To anyone looking in, he might have been sleeping. Sharon sat across from him on a long upholstered sofa, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She hadn't moved for some time. Her eyes remained fixed on the coffin, not in sorrow, not in longing, but with an intensity that didn't soften. Beside her, Mags Roach kept one arm around Sharon's shoulders. Mags had known her since girlhood, before the marriage, before the house, before the careful shrinking Sharon had learned to do. "You never have to look at him again," Mags said quietly. "This is it now, it's over." Sharon didn't respond at once, and Mags went on, her voice low, meant only for Sharon. "After the way he treated you, the things he did, this is the end of it now, Sharon. You're free." The word hung between them. Free. Sharon's mouth tightened slightly, but she didn't look away from the coffin. "Yes," she said at last. "It's finished." There was no tremor in her voice, no relief either, just a statement flat and final. Guests continued to move through the room in ones and twos. There were murmured condolences, hands pressed briefly to Sharon's arm, faces arranged into suitable solemnity. The Hargreaves were respected. People had come because it was expected of them. Outside, the wind had begun to rise. The sound of it pressed against the windows, low and persistent, as though testing the house. By evening, the rooms had emptied. The last of the neighbours departed with quiet goodbyes. Lamps were lit as the light faded, and shadows settled into the corners of the house. Mags remained. She stood near the foot of the stairs, adjusting her coat. "I'll bring my bags up," she said. "I'll take my usual room." It was said casually, as though the matter had already been decided, as though staying the night was the natural thing. Sharon turned to look at her then. "No," she said. Mags paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Mags hesitated, then moved back toward Sharon. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to be alone tonight, Sharon. Not with the storm coming in, not in a house like this." "I appreciate it, Mags. I do," Sharon said. "But I've spent my whole life being told where to stand and when to sit and when to be quiet. Tonight, I'm going to be by myself." Mags searched her face. Sharon's expression didn't change. "Well," Mags said finally, "if you're certain." "I am." There was another pause. "And I won't be at the burial tomorrow either," Sharon added. "I'll be dealing with these affairs in the next county, and I've no interest in seeing him off." Mags nodded slowly. "All right." Sharon rose. "I'll close the coffin before I go to bed. There's no need to worry about that." Mags gave her a last look, then reached for the door. Outside, the wind had strengthened, pushing rain hard against the windows. When the door closed behind her, the house seemed to draw in on itself. Sharon remained where she was for a time, alone with Edmund. She moved closer to the coffin and stood looking down at him. The lines of his face were familiar. She knew every one of them. "You always liked things just so," she said quietly. "You liked me just so too, didn't you?" The storm announced itself properly then. Thunder rolled overhead, the sound deep and close. The lamps flickered but held. "You used to call me your good little girl," Sharon went on. "Good little girl. That's what you call me. As if that's what I was. A child. A child who you could..." She paused. Her hand rested on the edge of the coffin. She didn't touch him. "Well, I'm nobody's good little girl anymore. Do you understand?" She turned away at last and went into the adjoining room. She poured herself a drink and took it in one swallow. As she set the glass down, something moved behind her. A book slid from a shelf and struck the floor. Sharon stared at it. It lay open, its pages splayed. She knelt and looked more closely. The text was dense, unfamiliar. Symbols marked the margins, the occult, and there, in the narrow space beside the print, were notes written in a hand she recognized instantly. Edmund's. She read only enough to understand the nature of it. Ritual, invocation, the language of command and obedience. She closed the book and set it aside, unsettled, and when she returned to the wake room, the coffin stood exactly where it had been, but empty. The storm broke in earnest then. Rain lashed the windows. Thunder shook the house. Sharon didn't scream. She stood very still, her gaze fixed on the hollow where Edmund had lain. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of movement, and a voice followed. "Good little girl, where are you, good little girl?" The voice was distorted as if dragged through broken breath. Lightning flared, and in its brief glare she saw him at the far end of the hall. His body moved unevenly, one leg failing to follow the other. His arms hung at twisted angles. He took a step forward. "Stay back," Sharon said. You won't touch me again." He advanced, slowly, his mouth forming shapes that had once been affectionate. "Come now, it'll be like
old times.
She retreated, her foot catching on the edge of a rug. He came on, steady and relentless. Lightning revealed him again, closer. His movements were jagged, his body held together by something that wasn't strength. The house echoed with his progress. Floorboards creaked and doors trembled.
You belong here with me. Yeah. You always did.
She fled up the stairs, the sound of his pursuit following her. The storm threw light and shadow across the walls, each flash revealing him nearer than before. At the top of the stairs she turned, and he was there, reaching for her, and the lightning split the dark.
If I can't have you, no one can have you. Now, take your beating, little girl.
Sharon ran. Her slippers slapped against the polished floor as she turned into the long west corridor. The house knew this route well. She had walked it 1,000 times, and tonight it felt longer. Behind her came the sound of him dragging himself forward. Not fast, never fast, just steady and patient.
You always did best when you stopped struggling. Do you remember?
She reached the end of the corridor and pulled a door shut behind her, shoving a chair beneath the handle. The room smelled of old paper and dust. Another crash of thunder rattled the house. The handle turned once and stopped. Then his voice came again, closer to the door than it should have been.
I never meant to hurt you. You were just a bad learner.
The chair scraped as the door shuddered. The frame groaned but held. Sharon backed away until her calves hit the bed. Lightning flashed again, and through the glass she saw his outline reflected faintly, standing where the door met the wall, his head tilted at an angle that didn't belong to a living man.
I kept you safe. I made you strong. You were mine.
The door burst inward with a crack of splintering wood. The chair skidded aside. Edmund stumbled through the opening and caught himself against the doorframe, breathing hard, though no breath should have been left in him.
You liked it quiet,
he said, his voice carrying oddly through the house.
You liked knowing your place.
Another flash. He was closer. Another, closer still. And then the light vanished for good. The next morning, the storm had passed. The air was clean and still. 2 men came to collect the coffin. They lifted it between them, careful and professional. Sharon, they knew, wouldn't be there, off seeing to other affairs, she said. One frowned slightly as he lifted the coffin. Shit, this is lighter than I expected. The other adjusted his grip. I thought it would have been heavier. They carried it out without further comment. If they had known any better, they might have said it bore the weight of a woman, not a man. Flowers lay at the gate. The house stood silent, and Sharon Hargreave was never seen again. As for Edmund Hargreave, there was no burial. They spread the blanket with the care of people performing a small ceremony. Fintan shook it once, twice, then flattened the last crease with a gentle swipe of his palm. "There," he said. "Perfect, exactly perfect." Petal clapped her hands softly, as if she might disturb the day if she made too much noise. "Oh, Fintan, you always make things perfect. Even the air feels nicer when you do things." They sat beneath the willow, its long branches hanging down around them like curtains. The river moved slowly behind it, brown and steady, and the grass was already warm from the sun. Spring had arrived properly, the kind of day people remembered years later and exaggerated. Fintan opened the basket. "I packed the bread you like, the soft one, and the jam, and the strawberries, and I washed them twice." Petal pressed her hands to her chest. "You remember everything about me, every little thing. I don't know how you do it." "I just look at you," he said, earnest as a prayer, "and then I know." She laughed, a breathy little sound. "Oh, stop, you'll make me cry again." "I don't mind if you cry, Petal," he said. "I like when you cry. It means you feel things deeply." She leaned closer, their knees touching. "I feel everything deeply with you, Fintan. I never felt properly alive before you." He picked up a strawberry and held it to her lips. "Open wide." She opened her mouth slowly, eyes never leaving his. He watched her chew as if it were the most important thing happening in the world. "Is it sweet?" he asked. "It tastes like you," she said without hesitation. "Nothing should ever change this," he said. "Promise me, Petal." "I promise," she said at once. "Even when we're old, even when our hair goes grey, even when we can't remember our own names." "I'll remember yours," he said. "I'll always remember you." They kissed, not once, not briefly. They kissed with commitment, with little pauses to smile, with whispered nonsense between breaths. The willow leaned. Petal lay back on the blanket and sighed. "This is the happiest I've ever been." Fintan rested on one elbow beside her. "Then this place should remember us." He reached into his pocket and took out the small knife he used for apples. "I'm going to carve our initials, just a little thing, so the world knows." Petal sat up, delighted. "Oh, yes, do it right here." He pressed the blade into the bark. The willow shuddered. Fintan didn't notice at first. He was too busy working carefully, tongue caught between his teeth. "F and P," he said aloud. "Forever." The bark split deeper than it should have. The ground gave a low, irritated sound, like someone clearing their throat after being ignored too long. Petal frowned. "Did you hear that, Fintan?" Before Fintan could answer, the willow moved. Its branches lifted, not swaying, but drawing themselves up. The bark split wide, opening into a dark mouth, and two deep hollows formed where eyes should have been, and something old and fed up looked out at them.
"Jesus, will you stop scratching at me?"
the tree said, voice low and rough, like a farmer roused from sleep.
"You pair of gobshites, that's a fine way to wake a body up, isn't it?"
Petal screamed. Fintan dropped the knife. The mouth opened wider.
"And don't go screeching like that either, giving me a bloody headache."
The two went absolutely still, hands clenched together.
"I was here before ye,"
The willow went on.
"I'll be here after. and now you've gone and marked me like a bloody fence post.
Fintan found his voice. I'm sorry, we didn't know.
You didn't know what?
The willow said.
That I'm alive, that I feel things. No matter, 'cause human bones make nice fertilizer, if you know what I mean.
Petal whimpered. Oh, please, Mr. Willow, don't eat us. The willow leaned in, its roots shifting beneath the soil.
Why? Why shouldn't I eat ye?
The two lovebirds stared at one another. Fintan squeezed her hand. Petal, he said softly. Tell him. She nodded, tears already slipping down her cheeks. We love each other, she said, more than anything. The willow said nothing. Fintan rushed on. We were meant to find each other. Out of everyone in the world, we make each other so much better. Petal leaned into Fintan, staring lovingly into his eyes. He sees me. He really sees me. I wake up thinking of her, Fintan said, looking straight back into her eyes. I go to sleep grateful she exists. Petal pressed her forehead to his. If you let us live, she said to the tree, we'll love each other kindly, gently, and we won't waste it. The willow's branches settled slightly. They kept talking. They talked about the first time they'd met, about the way he tripped over his words, about the way she laughed, about the future they planned with frightening confidence. We're going to have lots and lots of children, Petal said. And teach them to be good, Fintan said. And I'll bring them here, she said. And I'll tell them this is where our love grew, he said. The willow watched. They spoke until their voices shook, until their words ran together, until even they were embarrassed by how much they were saying and still couldn't stop knowing they had to say it. The willow looked at them both, a softness in his eyes.
Young love. Huh.
If you were fortunate enough to stroll the river path airily the next morning, you might have noticed something odd beneath the willow. Two sets of legs, boots still on, stuck out from the trunk where a mouth once had been. Bark closed tight around them as if it had finished chewing and lost interest. And just above, freshly cut and already darkening, were the letters F and P carved deep into the wood forever. The garden was the kind people slowed down for without meaning to. Even from the road you could see how it had been minded. The beds were neat, the paths were clean, the hedges had been cut with a steady hand. In summer the place carried colour the way a chapel carried candlelight, soft but constant. It sat out on the edge of the Waterford countryside, a small holding with a low cottage and a patch of land that looked to anyone passing like pride made visible. It wasn't done for show either. There was no sign, no gate left open for strangers to admire it. It was simply a garden that had been loved properly. The roses were the centre of it. That was what people talked about most. The rose patch ran along the southern wall where it caught the best of the light, and when the blooms came, you could smell them from the lane. Children used to pick at the petals if they were bold enough. Grown men would pretend they hadn't noticed and keep walking, cheeks red with embarrassment, while their wives muttered at them to stop gawking. In that house lived a young woman who had no children of her own, and no appetite for gossip, and no habit of sitting around. She worked the garden the way a person worked a prayer, early, quiet, day after day, and her name was Etna Fitzmaurice. The first sign of trouble wasn't a scream in the night or a beast at the window. No, it was a small thing that should have been nothing. One morning she came out with her basket and her shears, and she stopped at the roses. The stems had gone soft. Not all of them, just a few right in the middle, as if a pocket of the patch had fallen ill. The leaves were spotted. The colour was off. When she touched one bloom, it gave under her fingers and sagged as if it had been soaked. She leaned in close and looked for insects, for blight, for anything she could name. She found none. 2 days later, those same bushes were dead. They didn't die the way plants usually died, slow and honestly. They went dark in a sort of stretch of hours, as if the life had been pulled out from underneath. The stems shriveled, the petals turned the colour of old bruises. The soil around them looked disturbed, though she knew she hadn't been there since yesterday. Etna did what any careful gardener would do. She cleared the patch. She cut away the dead growth. She lifted the rotten stems and carried them to the far end of the field. She scraped back the topsoil and replaced it. She said nothing about it to anyone because there was no reason to trouble anyone with a sick plant. That was when she saw the roots. They weren't the fine, delicate threads you expected to find. There were thick, pale ropes of them running under the roses like a fist closing. They had buckled the soil, they had lifted the stones, they had forced their way up as if they had been searching for air. Etna sat back on her heels and stared down at them. There was a hawthorn tree a field away, old and gnarled, standing alone like a sentry. People in the area knew enough to leave the hawthorn trees alone. Children were warned off them. Farmers didn't cut them down. Even men who laughed at prayers and charms would step around a hawthorn without thinking. Etna had never touched that tree. She hadn't needed to. The roots under her roses weren't supposed to reach that far, not like this. And so she fetched her gloves, the heavy ones she used for briars, and went back down into the patch. She got her fingers around the thickest root and pulled. It didn't give. She changed her grip and pulled again, using her weight. The root flexed in the earth as if something below had shifted its shoulder. She paused, listening for a sound that might explain it. There was only the wind and the hedges and a rook calling out in the distance. She pulled again. The root finally tore, but it tore the wrong way. It snapped back, and the jagged end caught her glove. It ripped straight through the leather and cut into the skin beneath. Pain flared, sharp and clean. She jerked her hands away and saw blood welling in 2 fingers, one on each hand where the root had bitten her through. It was a small injury, the sort of thing that happened in a garden. She cursed under her breath and stood, holding her hands up, palms open, letting the cold air take the sting. Inside, she washed the cuts with water, wrapped them in clean cloth, and went back out to finish clearing the patch, working with care and keeping her fingers away from the torn root. By the next morning, the cuts looked fine. By the next evening, around them had taken on a colour she couldn't quite explain. It was green, but not the healthy green of leaves. It had a dull, sick shade to it, like something left too long in a damp cupboard. It crept out from the cuts in a slow spread, as if the colour had been poured under her skin. She scrubbed her hands raw in the basin, but the colour stayed. She held her fingers up to the window in the daylight and turned them this way and that, checking if it was dirt. It wasn't dirt, it was her. That night, as she sat by the range with a cup of tea she didn't drink, she pressed her thumb to the edge of the table. A thin, pale strand of root slid out from the pad of her thumb as if it belonged there. It curled across the wood. It gripped. It sank in. Etna pulled her hand back. Where her thumb had touched, the table looked older. A fine line of grain deepened, and a faint ridge rose up like the start of a root. She sat very still, hands on her lap, watching the table as if it might move again. In the morning, she tested it with a cold calm that frightened her more than panic would have. She touched a spoon. A pale green thread of vegetation slid out from her fingers, quick and sure, and wrapped around the handle. The wood of the handle darkened. A little sprout of something pushed up along the grain. She dropped the spoon like it had burned her. After that, she stopped touching anything. She didn't have to. She wore gloves. At first, garden gloves were enough. Then she doubled them. Then she found herself tugging her sleeve down over her wrists and keeping her hands folded inside the cloth as if she could hide them from the world. There were days where she managed, days where she cooked with care and cleaned with care and held on to a fragile routine that made her feel sane, and there were days where she forgot. A door frame, a chair back, the edge of the mantel. Each time, the same answer. Roots took hold from her fingers, and she started to fear her own hands, like unpracticed hands might hold a rifle. It was Grania who brought her back into company. Grania Shaughnessy was her sister, older by a few years, married to a steady man named Porrick, living only a short walk away. The two women had grown up as close as sisters could be. Grania had wanted a child for years. People tried to comfort her in the ordinary ways. They told her to stop fretting. They told her to take tonic. They told her it would happen when God decided it would happen. Grania nodded through it all, jaw set, smile thin, and she carried the longing like a stone. When it finally happened, it happened quietly. Etna heard it in the way Grania's eyes looked when she came through the door one afternoon, cheeks pink with a kind of strain. Porrick stood behind her with his cap in his hand, staring at the floor as if the news might fall and break it if he spoke it too loudly. "Okay, listen, we're keeping this to ourselves," Grania said, but her mouth was smiling, even as she tried to scold the joy into hiding. "And please, just don't say a word until we're sure, okay?" Etna nodded and forced her own smile into place. Her hands were in her pockets the whole time. As the weeks passed, Grania began to show. Her face filled out, her walk changed, her complaints became sharper, more human. She cursed the smell of cabbage, she wept over nothing, she laughed at Etna's jokes too hard, as if she was trying to squeeze every drop of goodness out of the days before the baby arrived. Etna, however, went to her sister's house less often than she used to, and each time she went, she kept her gloves on. Grania noticed. "You're wearing those like you're heading out to dig graves," she said one day, eyeing the thick leather gloves with amusement. "I was in the roses earlier," Etna replied, keeping her voice light. "Sure, you're always in the roses," Grania said. She reached out and caught Etna's gloved wrist in her hand, squeezing. "But you don't be so fierce delicate around me. I'm not made of glass." Etna smiled and let her sister hold her for the span of a breath, and then she eased her wrist away. Grania's belly grew, the house filled with preparations. A cradle appeared by the fire. Soft cloth was folded and stacked. Porrick fixed a loose board in the floor twice because he kept doing it wrong in his nerves. The neighbors began to call by, pretending they had errands, all of them cautious and warm and eager to take part. Etna watched it like a person watching a life from behind a window. She didn't tell Grania about the green color under her skin. She didn't tell her about the threads and the roots. The shame of it sat in her like an ache, and each time she thought to speak, she pictured her sister's face changing from joy to fear. She told herself she could control it. She told herself the gloves were enough. The labor came on a wet evening, the kind of evening where the light turned early and the world narrowed down to the sound of rain on roofs. A neighbour boy ran to Etna's cottage with his hair plastered to his forehead, his shoes full of water.
"It's after starting,"
he panted, eyes wide.
"Ma'am says you're to come quick, Miss Fitzmaurice."
Etna pulled on her coat with hands that shook under the leather. She took an extra pair of gloves and stuffed them into her pocket like talismans. She walked fast through the fields, taking the shortest way, stepping on stones where she could and keeping her feet from sinking into the soft ground. The Shaughnessy house was full of noise, not screams, not yet, but a busy, tense sound like a kitchen before a funeral meal. Women moved around with basins and cloths. Porrick stood in a doorway, looking lost, and hands opening and closing as if he wanted something to hold. Nora Keating, the midwife, was there already, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back tight. She caught sight of Etna and gave her one sharp look.
"Go in and sit by her," she said. "She's asking for you."
Etna stepped into the bedroom. Grania lay on the bed with her hair damp and her face pale. Her eyes found Etna instantly, and something in Etna's chest tightened with love and dread at once. "You're here," Grania whispered, as if she had been afraid Etna would refuse.
"I'm here,"
Etna said. She sat in the chair by the bed, keeping her hands folded in her lap, gloves on. Grania squeezed her eyes shut through a pain that ran across her in a wave. When it passed, she looked at Etna again, breathing hard.
When he comes,"
Grania said, stubborn even in pain,
"I want you to hold him first. You've waited as long as me."
Etna's heart lifted and fell in the same beat. She thought of roots from her fingertips. She thought of the spoon. She looked at her sister's face and saw such fierce happiness there that she couldn't bear to refuse it.
"All right," she said softly, "if that's what you really want."
Hours passed in a blur of breath and murmured instructions. The room grew hot with bodies and effort. Nora Keating moved like a general at a battle, calm and clipped, speaking only what mattered. Porrick was sent out and allowed back in, and then sent out again, his face grey. Etna stayed in her chair, a silent witness, every muscle tensed, listening to the pain rise and fall in Grania's voice. She kept her eyes on her sister's face because if she looked at her own hands for too long, she would start to shake. Near midnight, the baby arrived. A thin, sharp cry cut through the room, sudden and bright, like the first note of a song. Grania sobbed with relief. Nora lifted the baby, cleaned him quickly, checked him with practical hands, and laid him against Grania's chest. For a few breaths, the entire world steadied. Grania's face softened. She pressed her cheek to the baby's head as if she was trying to remember the feeling forever. Then, with a look that was almost fierce in its demand, she turned to Etna.
"Now,"
she whispered. Etna stood. She felt every eye in the room on her, though she knew nobody was watching her hands. They were watching the moment, the family moment, the ordinary miracle. Nora moved the baby gently from Grania's arms. "Hands under the head," she instructed, placing the child into Etna's arms as if Etna was any other woman. Etna's gloves pressed against the baby's blanket for a heartbeat. It was all right. The baby was warm, alive, small. He fit into the curve of Etna's arms like he belonged there. Etna felt the love rise in her so fast it hurt, and under that love she felt something else, a faint tug, like the pull of threads through cloth. Her breath stopped. She looked down and saw a pale root slipping out from the seam of her glove, thin as a string, quick as a worm. It curled around the baby's wrist. "No," Etna whispered, but the word came too late. The thread touched the baby's skin and spread.
It wasn't a burst, it was a creep, swift and certain, a quiet claiming. Fine lines ran along the baby's arm like veins turning into twig. The blanket stiffened where it touched him. A spray of tiny leaves unfolded along his sleeve as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Etna gasped and tried to pull her hands away, but the roots held. Grania sat up, eyes wide, watching. What are you doing? She cried, voice sharp with terror. Etna, give him to me. Etna fought her own arms as if they belonged to someone else. She tried to drop the baby, to fling the blanket free, to tear the gloves off. The roots didn't let go. Nora lunged forward, grabbing at the baby with bare hands. The moment her fingers touched the spreading growth, a thin root snapped out and caught her skin. Nora jerked back with a curse, eyes wild as if she touched a live wire. The room filled with shouts. Grania's cry rose into something animal. Etna stood in the center of it, trapped, staring down at what she'd done. The baby's cry cut off. The small warm weight in her arms stiffened. Where there had been flesh, there was wood. Where there had been a beating pulse, there was a quiet graying. Etna's hands shook so hard the roots trembled with them, leaves quivering in the lamplight like laughter. She forced her fingers open. The bundle dropped into the sheets. It landed with a dull, heavy sound of something that was no longer alive in the way a baby should be. Grania screamed. Porrick surged into the room, face twisted, and for a moment he looked like he might kill Etna with his hands. He saw the thing on the bed and went still, mouth open, eyes empty. Nora grabbed Grania's shoulders and pushed her back down, voice cutting through the chaos. Get her out, she barked at the women in the room. Now, get her out before she touches another thing. Hands seized Etna by the elbows, by the shoulders, careful, even in fear, as if she might infect them with a glance. Etna didn't resist. She couldn't. Her mind was a blank sheet with one terrible image pressed into it. They marched her out into the kitchen. The air felt colder in there. Someone shoved her coat at her. Someone opened the door. Someone spat on the floor as she passed. Etna stepped into the night. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear. The stars were sharp. She walked home without feeling her feet. She reached her cottage and found her own door standing open, swinging slightly on its hinges as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the table she had touched weeks ago had changed more. A thin ridge ran across it now, like a root trying to become a branch. She stared at it. She took a step back and her hand brushed the edge of the hearthstone. A pale, rooted thread slid out from under the glove and sank into the stone. Etna jerked her hand back, heart hammering, but the curse wasn't done with her. It had never been. She moved through the cottage with care and saw how the place had been answering for days without her noticing. A crack in the wall where something pale pushed through like a nail, a sprout at the base of the chair leg, a faint vein of root creeping along the floorboard seam. It was all hers, all a mark of her. She went to the basin and tried to pull the gloves off. They wouldn't come. The leather had stuck to her skin at the wrists as if it had grown there. When she tugged, it hurt, deep and raw, the way it hurt to pull bark off a tree. Etna sat down on the floor with her back against the cupboard and stared straight ahead until the grey light of morning came. By midday, people were already talking. They didn't say what had happened in the Shaughnessy bedroom, not in full. People never did. They spoke around it, in pieces, in careful half words. Something awful, a curse, the baby, Etna's name. By evening, nobody came near her cottage. She would have starved if she didn't still have her garden. She went out at dusk and lifted potatoes with her gloved hands, careful not to touch anything she didn't mean to. She ate them plain, sitting on her step, staring out at the field where the hawthorn stood. It looked the same way it always had, and yet Now, with what she knew, it looked like a thing that had been awake this whole time. In the days that followed, Etna tried to leave. She packed bread in a cloth and set off down the road, gloves on, coat tight around her. She made it as far as the hedge and stopped. The ground under her boots felt different. There was a pull in it, a drag that went up through her bones as if the soil itself knew her weight. She took another step and felt a sharp pain in her foot, sudden and deep. She stumbled back and saw, on the toe of her boot, a thin root curling up like a finger, seeking. She went back into her garden and sat under the hedge with her hands hidden in her sleeves, breathing hard. The land was keeping her. As weeks turned into months, the cottage changed more. The doorstep grew rough and knotted, the fence posts thickened, the garden beds rose and buckled as if something beneath was shifting its spine. She stopped trying to clean. There was no point. The broom's straw would take root. The cloth would sprout leaves. She learned to live with dirt and growth the way a sailor learned to live with salt. She spoke less and less until she barely spoke at all. Words felt risky, everything did. Her life narrowed down to the garden, the cottage, the field, the hawthorn tree watching from its place like an eye that never blinked. Sometimes at night, she thought she heard a sound in the dark, not a voice, not a whisper, a soft, dry movement like leaves rubbing together, though there was no wind. She stayed still when it came. Stillness felt like the only kind of safety left. Years later, people would avoid that stretch of road. Children were warned not to hop the gate. Men crossing the field would give the place a wide berth without saying why. The story had changed by then. It had been softened by distance and fear. They said a woman lived there who could turn you into a tree. They said her hands were green. They said if you saw her, you kept your eyes down and your mouth shut, and you walked on. They also said, quietly, as if it was a fact as ordinary as rain, that Gráinne Seachnasaigh never spoke again after that night, though she stayed alive and kept her house. Pádraig worked his farm like a man hauling a load that would never get lighter. The cradle remained by the fire until someone, years later, took it apart and burned it, and even then the ash clumped in a way ash shouldn't. As for Etna Fitzmaurice, there was no funeral for her when she stopped being seen. One spring, someone noticed her cottage looking lower, as if the roof had sunk. By the next spring, the roof was gone. In its place, there was a dense thicket, thick with hawthorn and briar, tangled and unwelcoming. No door, no window, no path. Only growth, only roots. And in the middle of it, exactly where a rose patch had once been, a young hawthorn stood that hadn't been there before, its branches sharp and patient, its leaves bright as if it had been fed well. People who passed that field would walk a little faster without knowing why, and if you find yourself thinking of a garden at night, of hands you can't trust, breathe slowly and let the thought pass on.
The children were playing where the grass thinned and the trees began. They chased one another between trunks and over roots, their shouts breaking apart as they ran. Sticks scraped bark, dirt kicked up, a branch cracked somewhere deeper in. An old man stood on the path and watched. He kept his hands folded behind his back and his weight settled through his heels. His coat was worn at the cuffs, his hair had gone the color of ash, and his face carried lines that had stopped moving years ago. One boy broke from the group and set about a young tree with a branch. He struck the bark again and again. Each blow left a pale mark that didn't fade. The old man stepped closer. "Oh, you don't want to be doing that," he said. The boy stopped and looked at him. "Why?" The old man considered the tree. He placed his palm against the bark for a moment. "I learned something once," he said, "about places like this." The boy waited, then shrugged. Someone called his name, and he ran back to the others. The old man stayed where he was. He looked at the mark in the bark, then turned and followed the path down the hill. Behind him, the trees stood as they always had. Many years before, when Turlough Shaw first walked that forest, he carried a notebook, a measuring cord, and a stick of white chalk. He was a forestry agent for a company with money enough to wait and appetite enough to take its time. He did not fell trees himself. He decided where men would come to fell them. His marks were instructions. His notes became orders. He worked alone. The forest lay above a narrow stream and rose again into a slope of older growth. Oak pressed close to ash. Roots broke the surface and twisted where the ground thinned. Light reached the floor in narrow bands and shifted as the day wore on. Turlough moved steadily, counting his steps, judging height by eye. He listened for the hollow sound beneath bark that meant weakness. He made marks as he went, a line here, across there, pale chalk against dark wood. He was marking a tree near the western edge when he felt watched. A girl stood between two trunks, a short distance off. Her dress was faded from wear, her shoes were scuffed. She didn't hide, she didn't approach. "You shouldn't cut these," she said. Turlough finished the mark before turning. "That's not your concern." "They matter," she said. He closed his notebook. "Everything matters to someone." She didn't argue. She watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back the way she had come. He continued his work. The next time he came, she was there again. She didn't speak. She stood at the edge of the trees and watched him move from trunk to trunk. He ignored her. On the third visit, he noticed her farther upslope, near a section where the ground dipped and the undergrowth lay pressed flat in a rough circle. He paused there to take a measure. He saw nothing of note. He marked a tree close by, a quick chalk cross. The dust caught his fingers white, and when he straightened, the girl was gone. By the fourth evening, the forest had settled into him. He knew where the ground softened without warning. He knew which trunks leaned toward the slope. He knew where the stream cut sharp below the roots. The work had become routine. The light shifted earlier than he expected. He was closing his notebook when he heard movement behind him. It wasn't the sound of a man. It was lower, faster, heavy without haste. He turned. A black shape crossed between the trunks and came straight for him. He ran. The forest closed around him as he went. Roots rose to meet his boots. The ground beneath him dipped without warning. The sound behind him stayed close and steady. He reached the nearest climbable trunk and pulled himself up without thought. The tree rose at an angle and leaned out toward the slope. Its bark was rough and scarred. He climbed until the branches thinned and stopped, pressed tight against the wood, and the trunk creaked under his weight. The sound came again, slow and deep, like wood settling where it should not. The tree shifted a fraction. He felt it through his hands, and below him, the cat, she, waited. She was larger than any cat he had known. Her body held a low, compact strength. Her fur took the light and kept it. Her eyes caught what remained of the day and held it without blinking.
This was not a creature of any world he knew. She didn't leap. She didn't rush the trunk. She simply watched. Her tail moved, slow and stilled again. Turlock's arms burned. The bark bit into his palms. He shifted his weight, and the trunk answered with another low creak. The ground below fell away sharply before breaking into rocks and water. If the tree gave, there would be no second chance. The light dimmed. That was when the shadows began to move. At first he took them for the deepening of evening. Then they stepped where shadows should not. Small figures, many of them, gathered between the trunks and along the slope. Black fairies, their forms dark and thin, edges hard to fix. They didn't approach him. They didn't look at him. They gathered and they waited. Fear settled into him, heavy and steady. He expected pain. He expected to be taken where he sat. The tree creaked again. A sound cut through the stillness then. A whistle. It was soft and it was clear, a single note, then another, rising and falling in a pattern that held together. It carried through the trees and settled into the air. The black fairy stood still as the sound moved among them. And with that sound, the cat, she shifted. Her body tensed. Her ears turned toward the sound. She didn't look at the tree. She turned away from it and moved down slope towards a shallow hollow in the ground. There, the earth dipped just enough to hide what lay within. Kittens, small and dark, pressed close together, their bodies little more than warmth and movement. One lifted its head and made a thin sound. The whistle rose again, sweeter now, steady and calm. The cat, she lowered her head and moved closer to the hollow. Understanding reached Turlock in pieces. The flattened ground he'd ignored. The girl standing watch, the cross he'd drawn without thought. He looked down the trunk and saw it again, pale against dark bark, his mark, close enough to the hollow that his chalk dust still lay on the leaves. He had marked the place where they hid without knowing. The whistle softened, and with that, one of the kittens climbed out of the hollow and climbed part way up the trunk where Turlock was sitting. In the most gentle of movements, it reached out and touched his boot, made a soft sound, and slipped back down again. The kitten's mother looked up at him then. Her gaze held no anger, only judgment. The dark fairies shifted as one, not closer or farther, an allowance. The whistle fell away. The space below the tree cleared, and Turlock was safe to move. He tested the trunk with his weight. It creaked again, louder now, a warning. He descended slowly, careful with each step, keeping his weight close to the wood. The tree held, and when his boots touched the ground, he didn't run. The cat, she gathered her kittens one by one and vanished between the trunks. The dark fairies faded back into shadow, and the forest settled. Turlock didn't sleep well that night. He returned days later. The chalk marks stood out pale against the bark, and he rubbed them away with his sleeve until nothing showed. He worked the western edge last and stayed only long enough to finish, and when the men arrived, he turned them back. No reason given, no argument offered. He filed no report. The company pressed. He refused, and they found different land. And so years passed. Turlock left the work in time and moved into a smaller house near the trees. He kept to himself. He walked the path often and left the forest as he found it. The trees grew. And on a spring afternoon, long after, he stood by the path and watched children play. A boy struck a young tree with a branch. Turlock stepped forward and spoke gently. The child ran back to the others. The noise rose and fell again. Turlock watched the mark in the bark for a moment, then turned and walked home. Behind him, a young girl watched from the trees, having not aged a day, and walked off with a smile. When you wake in the morning, please like, subscribe, and leave a small comment. Tell me where you're listening from, perhaps. Those quiet words and clicks are what keep this channel alive. The small signs that let the stories continue. Come back every night and let this be your resting place. Good night.